We proved that you could get Silicon Valley excited about working on something that was important to DoD and that there was a process for doing that. I met Steve Blank in the middle of that, and what was supposed to be a 20-minute conversation turned into a 4-hour discussion on a driver's board. When I realized that what I was doing and what Steve had been teaching for a bunch of years were virtually identical.
Welcome to the Startup Defense. Today I have Pete Newell. And Pete, we got introduced by a mutual acquaintance, a friend of mine, Nick Swain. He was at James Madison University and he ran an amazing program with the students there. And so I had heard about hacking for defense, which really had caught my interest. Digging into this, you are a man of many things, and I'd like to jump into that. Before we jump in and talk about Hack4X and BMNT, can you give our audience a little bit of background, who you are, what you're passionate about, how you show up for the world, that kind of thing?
Sure, I'm a classic crackpot. I laugh when I say that. My great grandfather was a fantastic architect, but he was also an inventor. He was an amazing photographer. He did a lot of different things. And I used the crackpot comment because for years, that's what I knew him as. It's the guy who did all kinds of stuff. Yeah. And it wasn't until, I got out of the military service and started a company and then started another company and another company and another company that I realized I was him. Now I'm assuming that my great grandchildren are going to say the same thing about me down the road sometime. I am probably the least likely person to ever launch a company, much less work in the defense optional space. I was not a great student in high school, not a great student at college. In fact, I actually flunked out of college at one point. I entered the military in order to make money to get through college and then ended up staying for 30 plus years. I spent most of my time as an infantryman doing tactical stuff in the military. And then towards the end of my career, the Army accidentally placed me as the director of the Army Rapid Equipping Force, which essentially was the Army's skunk works. And it was the first time they had taken an operator off the battlefield and given them the keys to the Ferrari of skunk works. And so just go find a problem and solve them. And I tell people that I literally had to go Google Rapid Equipping Force when they told me I was taking the job. They had no idea what it was. And once I Googled it, I went to one of my peers and said, I have no idea what I did to deserve this left turn. And as it turns out, it was, if not the most, one of the most professionally rewarding assignments I ever had. It really was. In that time, quite frankly, is what set me on the path of being a permanent problem solver. I didn't see myself as being particularly inventive or being an entrepreneur or something. It's not something that I ever saw in myself. Although as I look back, I realized I had been problem solving my entire career, working against the grain sometimes or making up my own rules sometimes. I'm probably fortunate that my career lasted as long as it did because I'm not great at following rules that don't make sense to me. That in turn made me really, really well suited for the job as the Rapid Equipment Force director. The Army said, hey, it's time to finish doing that and go to your next job. I said, thanks, I don't want another job. At that point, decided to retire. That was the birth of BMNT, was simply, you want to keep doing this, but I realized the only way I'll be allowed to do what I think I need to do is I need to do it from the outside. We literally launched BMNT as a 4-person company with no money and no jobs and no anything else, with the intent on actually solving the problem of the culture clash between Silicon Valley and DoD.
I think in the kind of entrepreneurial and startup space, we talk about voice of the customer. And I don't think anyone has extreme problems and hands-on experience with that problem as actual operators. But it's interesting to see in defense how abstracted solving that problem becomes when the guy who needs the problem solved knows every detail about how they would like to see it done. But the person solving that problem might be 10,000 miles away and have a very clinical sense of what that is. Was Rapid Equipping Force, was it to bridge that gap between needs and solution, or was it to be able to test out prototypes really quickly and get it into a production product that could be used across the Army?
First, I'll tell you, it doesn't exist anymore, which is, I think, one of the true crimes of the decade. It was shut down, I think, 3 years ago. when the Army Futures Command stood up and they came up with a different platform to do different things. And it was truly a loss to the service. The purpose was simply to go find problems that weren't being solved by programs of record or find opportunities to accelerate the use on the battlefield to accomplish the mission for the soldiers who were deployed. And there were no limits to it. So whatever the drones or robotics or fiber optics or communication systems, really no limits to the types of problems that we were expected to go find and solve. The challenge in the system that, as you just described, is not necessarily the distance between the person with the problem and the person with the solution. It's the fact that the system is designed to perfectly describe the requirement for the solution before the system is validated that they understood the problem, has perfected the process of providing the perfect solution to the wrong problem. Going back years of looking at the problems in DoD and understanding that the first pivot we usually make with a problem is when we tell the problem owner that they got the problem, that they were treating a symptom. So as an entrepreneur, you're used to doing pivots on products and solutions. In the defense space, the first pivots come when you look at a problem and realize you got the problem wrong. And then you can start actually pursuing the right solution that matches the speed of the change of the problem to the speed of the change in the tech you're trying to use. You're trying to solve for that impedance mismatch between the two.
You took that experience and then you launched BMNT, and then you're providing that quick cycle, iterative, problem-centric approach to large organizations and DoD entities.
Like typical entrepreneurs, we've lost BMNT and then we figured out what we were going to do.
I love it.
The first couple of years were lame and ugly. BMNT has, and obviously perfected, we have become students of the process of the business process behind doing what I just described. So how do you go into an organization and assess where they're at and then teach them how to extract problems, how to do analysis, how to curate them so that before they say we're just going to solve every problem, is that they're only working on those problems that need to be solved and are ready to be solved. And then what is the process of discovery you use to validate the problem, validate the solution, validate the pathway, validate the team that you expect to scale it. And then what's your transition plan for moving it from one place to another so that it doesn't die? Or what's your plan for killing things off when you realize they're not corrupt anymore? BM&T's management consulting business has largely been built around how to help an organization understand how to do that and do it at the pace that the world around them is chasing. That's probably 80% of the work we do. And because we do that for so many large organizations, we get the opportunity to look across a broad swath of the government, the United States, the UK, and Australia, and are able to increase the pace of learning as different organizations go through that process.
That makes a lot of sense. So instead of just coming in and saying, hey, we're entrepreneurs and we can do this innovation theater for you and come up with some jazzy solutions, I was reading an article that you wrote about developing entrepreneurial leaders and managers. You're really building that capability into the larger organization so they can do this maybe without you, right? So they can become a more innovative company. And that is an amazing perspective, obviously a longer term value for them. But what triggered my brain is because I work with prime contractors, I work with big tech companies, and even the gold standard big tech companies that everyone thinks they're the most innovative on earth, organizations exist to sustain the organization by and large. There could be 100,000 people that work for that big company that it just pops into your head, but there's probably 1,000 people that actually do what you think that they do in that whole company, maybe even less, maybe 100 or 200 people. Their tolerance for risk is very, very low because corporations exist to maintain themselves. I could see that being a lot more challenging than you made it sound like just, hey, we go in here and we teach them how to be and manage entrepreneurship. I'm sure you can't pull your best stories, but if you could just share a couple of stories or wins, name aside, I'd be interested in that because their tolerance for risk, if companies can get over that, they really have all the capabilities to do anything.
I can block it at multiple levels. And just to reinforce what you said, there's a business process for doing entrepreneurial things inside an organization. You have to understand the business of the business. And then you have to understand how to build business process that connects various innovation activities to one another so that the output of one activity leads to an input of the next activity. And that you understand who's making decisions about what moves from one to the next and what data those decisions are made. So when you look at an activity in organizations, okay, you're going to run a hackathon. Great. Why? And the output of that hackathon is going to be what? And who takes that output on and does something? Part of the process with these large organizations is, okay, just show me the activities and then show me the data that the activity produces. Show me who's doing the analysis of data and producing the insight that goes to what decision about what you're doing that's entrepreneurial or has to move at speed. We got out of talking about innovation as a thing and basically said innovation is a cultural process that leads to mission acceleration. It's not a thing by itself. It is a process that's largely based on social culture of how people create assumptions about things. They create MVPs, they do tests, they get data, but it's really about decision making. And if you can increase that speed of the decisions being made, you can help an organization to actually accelerate solving its problems or solving problems for its customers. The challenge though is there's not a profession in the government for doing that. I mean, I go so long about it. If you're a VC, I know what your job is. If you're a startup founder, I know what your job is. If you're a financier, I know what your job is. When it comes to the government, you can go to somebody and say, who's the innovator? Everybody raises their hand. Without creating that profession, the government doesn't hold on to people who are like me because they get frustrated over time and then they leave and go do it in the commercial world where they can actually make money and make headway and feel good about the work they're doing. Particularly DOD largely runs on what we would call doctrine policy that drives all that. So without a doctrine for mission acceleration, how to turn innovation into something that actually produces results, there are no job descriptions for the people that are necessary as part of that ecosystem. And without job descriptions, you just have this mismatch of people doing stuff, which trends towards innovation theater or heroics rather than a deliberately developed system that produces people who can function at a high level and do this in stressful circumstances repetitively.
I think this pushes massive risk. It's easy to see in the commercial world, these companies, they grow, and at a time, IBM was untouchable, but they become stagnant because they favor stability versus innovation. And so they look at innovation as a risk or a disruption of what they're currently doing. Whereas in the long term, it's easy to be agile and small and just go a different way. I hate using words like disruption, but everybody knows that it happens because IBM's still a fantastic company, but they're not the company. For 50 years, they were the company, and now they're a company. But when we talk about DoD applications, that looks like a very slow process to get, say, UAVs in place, while the enemy is already just going and buying cheap Chinese drones and popping them out without a problem. We have to build an entire architecture. Now, a lot of that's in place, but it took 10 years to get that into place where we have, I think, 16 now blue UASs that we can pick and put systems on. But that safety, avoiding the risk of, say, oh, we don't want to deploy something that might not be the best or might not be the perfect thing over a very short time horizon, that becomes a massive risk to your normal capabilities. So I kind of look like adopting risk as a de-risking activity.
No, that's accurate though. So let's talk about risk for a minute. In combat, you want to avoid risk at the tactical end. We can talk about the Ukraine all day long. They are applying solutions in just time after time after time. I will tell you, it's chaotic and it's really messy. It's
Mhm.
really, really messy. It's highly inefficient, but it's very effective. Highly inefficient, very effective. As soon as the war's over, what happens? Being effective suddenly becomes less important than being efficient. And we change the way we talk about risk. So in peacetime, in the United States today, relatively at peace, people talk about risk as if it's a risk to being efficient, not the risk of being effective because you deployed your efficient solution too slowly. In the entrepreneurship world, it's like risk to market. Everything's about managing risk, but it's all pushed forward. In the government, when you start talking about risks to efficiency, Everything becomes slow and ponderous. It creates walls so that things can't happen. And we realize the way technology is working today and how solutions are coming about from the commercial world versus the defense world. You can't continue to behave that way. There has to be a place where effective is the most important thing you do. And efficiency is something you can achieve over time. It's just not the first thing you ask for. So even in the Rapid Equipping Force, we used to tell people that the most significant factor we tracked was time to deliver. Effectiveness was more important than being efficient. And we would take risk to gain speed, and then we would work on effective over time as we learned more about the solution and the environment we were providing the solution into. That's the antithesis of the way the system works today. And it's the antithesis of the way most big organizations think.
Does Hack4X play into that from a philosophical or just a implementation perspective?
Yeah, I mean, it really does. H4X, and we call it hacking for everything or anything, depending on how you look at it. It started as an accident, but it was a deliberate accident. I had spent a ton of time at Stanford while I was at the Rapid Equipping Force and met a couple of professors who eventually did a case study on the Rapid Equipping Force. They used that case study to write the chapter of a book called Scaling Up Excellence. I learned a lot about myself, but a lot about the organization, what we're doing from participating on a case study for 6 months. And what came from that was my understanding of the need to generate problems and then connect those problems with an entrepreneurial system of discovery that looks a lot like lean so that we could focus on working on the things that were most ready and most important, but have a chain of custody to go from problem to solution to scale. I met Steve Blank by accident. Literally, we were working on a study for somebody and we were using problems from distributed logistics in the Pacific Ocean as a means of proving that we could take a military problem and translate that into plain English that made sense to the commercial world. And then go out and talk to a bunch of people in the commercial world and get them to validate the problem for us because that problem also exists in the commercial world. Then we could get them to help us rewrite the problem again so that it would be exciting for commercial companies to take on. The output of that study was we had teams of, I was using students at Stanford who would then brief managing partners of venture capital firms like Sand Hill. When they briefed those guys were taking that paper out of the hand and say, this is great stuff. I'm going to email it to all my portfolio companies, and I want you to come in and talk to them. We proved that you could get Silicon Valley excited about working on something that was important to DoD and that there was a process for doing it. I met Steve Blank in the middle of that, and what was supposed to be a 20-minute conversation turned into a 4-hour discussion on a driver's board. When I realized that what I was doing and what Steve had been teaching for a bunch of years were virtually identical. He started with a product idea. I started with a problem. But the processes we were using that, quite frankly, identified the process of lean discovery was the process that was needed to do that. We were operating from this thing and how well it had gone. And we had to look at the government client and former Secretary Bill Perry and some other luminaries and say, it's great, but it's not scalable. We use Stanford students on spring break to do the work. You can't afford to hire people to do this at scale all over the place. And Stanford students, quite frankly, while they're going to school, don't have a lot of extra time for side projects. One of the students stood up in the back of the room, raised his hand, and said, hey, wait a minute. Had this been a class at Stanford, I would have taken it. 9 months later, we launched the first Hacking for Defense class at Stanford University. For an academic university to launch a new class in less than 3 years is like light speed. Hacking for Defense, and Nick Swain, as you mentioned, Nick was a fantastic proponent of it when he was at James Madison University. That class is being taught in 70 or 80 universities around the world now. But it's not just Hacking for Defense. There are Homeland Security programs that support FEMA, the TSA. There's probably 7 or 8 universities teaching hacking for climate classes. In the UK, they're doing local policing and health and a couple of other things. And now we're in the midst of building a hacking for space program internationally. But it's all based on this same principle of find the problem and then get that problem in the hands of these really entrepreneurial students who will work on diverse teams to validate the problem, prove that there's a potential solution to the problem that meets the user's definition of useful, and that there's a pathway by which you can actually develop the solution and deliver it back to the user. That process gets at so many problems around the world that it virtually endless opportunity to take on new problems and do that with. The important part is that we're using government problems to get students excited about becoming entrepreneurs working on government problems, the experience they're after. Yeah. And as Stanford students will tell you, it is the hardest class they take in their academic career because it's truly like building a startup. In fact, that class has churned out, I think, 52 startups in like 8 years.
That's fantastic. More people that are interested in founding companies, I try to steer them and say, hey, look at what's happening in DoD. Look at how that market is evolving. It really is a high value space. And depending on what you're working on, there's probably a home for really cutting edge projects. And there are more contract vehicles that are out now than there were in the past, OTs. And there's more organizations like AFWorks or DIU that are working with people that are, say, non-traditional primes on getting innovation in. So hearing you say, yeah, getting students interested in not just starting the next Facebook, but starting something that can really have meaningful impact and solve really, really big global issues. I love it. It's exactly what I want to hear
Yeah.
because I've run incubators and accelerators, and really, really smart people get focused on solving small problems. It really doesn't matter how well you solve them. You're just working on a small vehicle. There's just not much you can do with the resources you have, but there's massive problems that a 2 or 3 person startup can, they can launch a meaningful business in DoD.
The other, and I would call it the more significant output is even if they don't launch a company, if they decide to go work in the government, they're bringing that entrepreneurial skill set and that discipline to a government organization and helping them think differently. And to us, that's the reason we launched the course is we wanted young people to be more interested in national service, whether that's not joining the military, but actually going to work on these problems, either inside the government or outside. But they also become an extension of SpaceWorks, AppWorks, NavalX, DIU, because they're part of the ecosystem. And it's easier to get them to speak the same language. I don't care if they're at SpaceX or if they're at Autodesk or Microsoft or Amazon, they will answer a query from DIU or somebody else, and they help create this really rich ecosystem because they're part of it. And I think that is the important output of the program. It's really about the people. Now, the students are interesting, but you think about a student team that's interviewed 100 people over the course of a semester, and the ecosystem they built around that specific problem is transportable. They have the best understanding of the problem, the best understanding of the ecosystem around it, and they truly are the national experts in it. But they built a molecule around it. Now you just have to give that molecule to somebody else. It's still there. I mean, you've created these really cool ecosystems of people that you can actually use over and over and over again. Most of which, though, is just built on a common language. They understand the process by which how they got there. The other thing is the problems we find is most of the problems that DoD has exist in the commercial space somewhere, but the DoD is challenged in finding the people with those problems and translating theirs against the other space so that it makes sense. And then, even though they're starting to build these contract vehicles, it's the doctrine or the process for building a dual use investment thesis for a startup that says, I understand the government problem, I understand the commercial problem, and I understand how to use government dollars to do product discovery and market discovery without using my equity. Then when it comes time for me to look at the commercial market, I'm much more attractive to an investor because I still have my equity, which allows me to build a bigger, better company that will eventually deliver a better product back to the government at a cheaper cost. That's a profession that takes people both in the government and outside working together to figure out.
Interesting. I like that perspective because inside of the federal market, you have innovation challenges, grants, SBIR, many, many programs from $10,000 to millions of dollars of non-dilutive funding that you can get into a startup. Whereas in the commercial world, you could win a pitch contest for 500 bucks. Maybe you win the biggest pitch contest in America. It's 50,000 or $100,000. You're competing against a lot of people, but there's routinely grants that far exceed that are non-dilutive and a lot less competitive, to be honest.
The missing link, and this I come back to the to Dewey's investment thesis, though, is those dollars are largely delivered based on advancement of tech, not on producing a team that has the ability to deliver the tech. That's largely held in the commercial space. When they're evaluating the solution, nobody's looking at the CEO and her partners or whatever else and saying, that's great, but you got a really weak team. So use some of that money to hire some better people to work with you. They don't talk like that. As an investor, we talk like that all the time. In fact, it's the first thing you look at and say, it's a great problem, great tech, crappy team, not investing. So this dual use investment thesis has also got to account for three metrics. We talk about technology readiness level. Where is the tech in terms of development? Is it really basic or is it advanced as a prototype? But we also look at that technology readiness level in terms of how fast is the problem changing. Because the rapidly changing tech attack a rapidly changing problem means that by the time you put the money in and produce a solution to this thing, the problem will change too much. So you're trying to get those right. The second thing is we look at the adoption readiness level. Who are the first users going to be? Where am I going to go to get that? When I get the grant from the government to go do something, who are the users, the operators that I'm going to go to give me feedback on the product so that I can actually get something from my experience? And then when it comes time to actually deploy at a bigger scale, who are they? Who's the first unit that we're going to equip? How do I get there? What's the process? And then finally, the part that they don't talk about is what we call an investment readiness level. Is do I have the right team who, if we see the solution and we agree to it, has the ability to scale and deliver that solution over time? It's not a yes/no thing. It's how much of my investment needs to go to advance the technology to a point where the first adopter will actually use it and break it and give me feedback to it. And how much of that money needs to go to building a better team who has a better grip on their IP, has a better ability to actually meet the needs of the system in order to produce the thing. That's part of that dual use investment thesis that takes funders from inside the government actually talking to investors from outside the government. So they understand how the rules can be mutually complementing in order to benefit advancing something at a much more rapid pace.
That is very interesting. I wish that was farther along and that there's more definitive places that I could point to and say, hey, there's this program that is really pushing together maybe a public private partnership where you see this. I do a lot in clean tech, and I know that the OTT office at NREL, they have partnerships with, say, Chevron, that
Yep.
on that side, but that's pretty new too.
There are three places where I think you can, for instance, if you look at Naval X and the unmanned task force within the Navy has largely adopted that language and is actually starting to build a business process that allows them to do that. So that language, it's in there. The Defense Logistics Agency's J6, the folks who do digitization, have largely adopted that approach and it really does a fantastic thing over the last several years. And then the current one, probably surprise you, is ARPA-H, the Advanced Research Project Agency for Health. What I described is what is being built as the platform for ARPA-H. And everything I just said, you will look at it and say, oh my God, that's exactly what we've been talking about. So there are some good ones out there that are starting to come together. This is the language of the doctrine by which we're going to do this. These are the business processes. And this is how we're going to build that dual use environment. And literally now they're working through the prototypes and figuring out what works, what doesn't work, and where they need a policy change or where they need a language change. And they're starting to attract really cool people and really cool companies to work with.
That's tremendous. I personally, I've been in building defense electronics, been in defense manufacturing my whole life, but I've been developing products for 15 years in the space. And even in that period of time, I've seen a big shift with how projects get initiated and how they get brought to market, whether it's federally or it's dual use. Just in the past short period of time, 3 to 5 years, it's been a big shift. And I want to pick your brain. I know you're a busy man, but before you go, how can people keep an eye on this and get involved? If all of this talk was exciting to them, they say, I want to jump in here. I want to understand more about the opportunities. I'm a student, I'm a startup, I'm a entrepreneur. I want to get involved or I just want to track this. What's the best way to stay involved and stay in the know?
Get involved. I think you have to be part of the conversation, or you have to be part of the network. And I can listen to a variety of things. The easiest thing to do is whenever you read something, actually leave a comment or ask a question. For somebody who's been at this professionally for 13 years, answering questions that people ask is how I learn. And I think when you look at all these processes and the things that happen, there has been a significant inflection point over the last, I'd say, 4 years of improvement and being specific about what we're doing and disciplined and getting there. But we still question it a lot. I mean, getting fresh talent, fresh eyes on something, fresh questions forces us to stop and rethink what we're doing so that we get out of the group thing. So even if you're not an expert, just non-expert questions causes us to think harder than expert questions do because we start to question everything we're doing. Getting involved in hacking for defense, climate, homeland security, whatever else, as an advisor or a mentor to a student team is the fastest way to learn about something. You actually be amazed. I still teach the class at Stanford with Steve Blank and a few others. And while it takes a huge amount of time out of me, I learn more about entrepreneurship and about technology and other things working with those students than I do going to 1,000 events at South by Southwest or anything else. When you actually get in and specifically work on something with real people doing real problems, the experience is absolutely amazing, but it also helps you to connect with them. So I think those are the two biggest things that people can do.
I appreciate that. That's fantastic advice. Pete, thank you so much for your time. We covered a lot of territory. I have so many more questions to ask, but I'll have to reach out and say, hey, can you come back in 6 months?
I'm happy to come back and talk more.
Yeah, I really appreciate the time. And where's the best place that people can follow what you're doing? LinkedIn? Are you active on Twitter? Where can people engage?
I ban myself on Twitter. LinkedIn is, particularly if you follow me, Peter A. Newell, or you follow BMNT, or you follow the Common Mission Project, which is the nonprofit that runs Acting for Defense. Those three will connect you with a ton of things. Obviously, you go to bmnt.com, which is our website, which also has a ton of resources in it. We write prolifically. So if you go to BMNT's blog, virtually everything we've ever written, every podcast we've ever done, or analysis of the podcast, are all on that blog. And there's some great history in there that folks are worth with. I also highly recommend Steve Black's blog, go steveblack.com. Steve has written prolifically about defense issues for a long time, and you can really see his trail of thought in there as well.
All right. Well, we'll make sure that you have all your links in the description, in the show notes, so everybody can check that out. And to go see Steve Blank, he's really big advocate for DoD and government innovation inside the startup world, which not everybody shares that same vision. And I always appreciate that from him. Thank you so much. This has been the Startup Defense